Hi, everybody. I'm part of the planning committee and want to give Gabriele a warm welcome. Thank you for being available and making it possible for you to present tonight. I can't do any better than you have done, obviously, on your introduction. So thank you for that. And why don't we start? And the topic is History and Story, Elsa Morante, Rome, La Storia, and the Shoah. So thanks so much in advance, Gabriella, for being a part of this.
Sure, thank you all for having me. I'm seeing that some folks are in the waiting room or trickling in, so I'm assuming someone else can tackle that while I just go ahead and get started here. I've got a lot I could say. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very grateful and honored by the Dante Society, and I'm going to speak about Elsa Morante, who's a Roman, and her novel La Storia. If you had happened to be strolling along the Tiber River in the heart of Rome on a sunny afternoon in the 1970s, you might have seen a dark-haired and rather striking-looking woman in her late 50s behaving somewhat oddly. She was peering closely at the walls, doorways, and buildings. She was scribbling in a notebook. She occasionally removed her eyeglasses to look even closer. She paused to chat with the locals. And she may have even left out a few snacks for the famous stray cats of Rome before she headed home. I have a few photos for you today from Armando Moreschi. That's him in the lower corner of the Roman Jewish neighborhood that this person, Elsa Morante, was strolling through.
Gabriella, I'm not seeing your slides.
Well, let me go back then. Start from the beginning. How's that?
Great, thank you.
Okay, so you have Elsa Morante here in the center in Rome. And then these are the photos of the area that I was speaking of that she was wandering through in the early 1970s. And they are courtesy of Armando Moreschi. Just a little flavor of the place where she was. So before I explain what it was that she was doing, let me clarify that it was not odd at all to find a Jewish neighborhood in the Eternal City. There have been Jews in Rome for over 2,000 years, and in fact, the Jewish community is in Rome is one of the oldest communities and cultures present within the Italian peninsula, dating back to at least the pre-Christian Roman period. And I had mentioned the stray cats of Rome. Elsa Morante was a huge cat lover, so I ended up writing my doctoral thesis on a crazy cat lady. Strange but true. And that's my husband, James, on the Gianicolo with a cat and some other cats. You can visit the remains of an ancient synagogue today in the Trastevere neighborhood. It's in the basement of a restaurant, which is using it as a wine cellar. So here's my photos of it, and I'm afraid it was rather dark in there. So that's me in 2014 looking at it. And speaking of things that are now underground, there are a number of Jewish as well as the famous Christian catacombs scattered underneath the city. So this is a little bit of a map showing where some of these are, with historic Rome's in the center, and you can see radiating out from it the different sites. There is even an ancient Jewish catacomb underneath the villa that Mussolini used as his official residence, Villa Torlonia. And these catacombs give us some glimpses of what Jewish Roman life in antiquity was like. While not all of these catacombs can be visited today, you can see by the decorations here just how much information scholars might glean from what's in the catacombs. However, and I'm just going to have to move really rapidly through this fascinating history, tensions between the Roman Empire and its province of Judea eventually would explode in the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 CE, or Common Era, what some folks call AD. The year 70 CE was in fact a watershed year. The Great Revolt ended in disaster for Judea with the Roman capture and sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. Historian Flavius Josephus describes the carnage, burning, and looting in his book, The Jewish War. And then upon their return to Rome, the generals Vespasian and Titus and their soldiers celebrated a triumph. This was a Roman tradition where there was a parade of the conquered people and the booty from Jerusalem. And this slide is documenting that triumph. And you can see they're holding up a menorah taken from the temple. This is on the Arch of Titus, which is behind me in the background there. The Arch of Titus still stands today, portrays this conquest, and kind of, I think, sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today, that there's an intermingling and a very long history that shapes the events in the 20th century and beyond. Though there is much I could tell you about the intervening centuries, I will skip ahead to another key moment in Roman Jewish history, which is the Renaissance. So Renaissance popes are, I think, the best popes. They're colorful characters. They often don't adhere to the standards of our contemporary popes, whether it's nepotism or intrigue. But they also, of course, sponsored wonderful works of art and culture. And when Pope Leo X was on the papal throne, he, along with other city-states in northern Italy, were receptive to the Jews who were fleeing the Iberian Peninsula. 1492 isn't just the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, which is what I was taught in school, but also the year when, with the Reconquista finished, the Kingdom of Spain expelled its Jews and was followed by Portugal doing the same in 1497. So this created a wave of refugees that headed across Europe, but found sanctuary in northern Italy, especially since they'd been forced to liquidate their possessions and arrived cash in hand. This was really the start of a key long-term trend of Jews settling in the north of Italy. At this point in history, 1492 and well into the Risorgimento, there's Spanish territories in the south of Italy, which are also not welcoming to Jews, just like Spain itself. So I would mention this long-term trend of Jews settling in the north of Italy. Venice had established a ghetto, the world's first in 1516. Oops, wrong slide. And paradoxically, although we have such negative associations with the term ghetto, this was a guaranteed space where Jews were allowed to live permanently and practice. And so paradoxically, it was seen as attractive and an example of tolerance, although there were many things that were problematic about it. Then after, let's see, after Pope Leo, we have also Pope Julius, marking another golden age where there was acceptance of even religious dialogue across boundaries of faith. A Roman Jewish printing press was allowed. But there were troubling signs even in the Renaissance that this kind of cross-cultural appreciation, if you will, was not going to last. And indeed, it did not last. Pope Paul IV, who only had a very short time as Pope, former leader of the Roman Inquisition, immediately upon ascending the papal throne, took drastic measures. This is in part due to the Protestant Reformation and the Church's reaction. The Pope assumed that the Jews wrongly, as it turns out, were somehow complicit in the Protestant Reformation, and he issued a notorious papal bull, Cum Nimis Absurdum, on July 14th, 1555. And in that bull, he established a ghetto at Rome, as well as outlined a very segregated vision for how Jews and Christians should coexist in the eternal city. The papal bull takes its title, which is pretty customary, from its opening line, as it is completely absurd and improper in the utmost that Jews have insolently invaded our city Rome and a number of the papal states, that they dare to live amongst the Christian people. And it goes on from there. You can imagine that sets the tone. So Jews must live in a ghetto. They are not supposed to eat, play, or fraternize with Christians. They must wear distinguishing blue hats. They are not allowed to practice trades except for rag picking. They cannot be physicians to Christians, and more. The spot for the new ghetto was on the left bank of the Tiber River, which was undesirable real estate since the river regularly flooded the area. And the harsh restrictions that the Pope set up impoverished and segregated Rome's Jews. And the era that this papal bull ushered in is often referred to as the era of the ghetto in Italy. And this is going to go on for about 3 centuries. And while this era of the ghetto persists, Jewish populations do continue to become consolidated in the northern end of the peninsula. And of course, at this point, the Pope doesn't just control Vatican City, he controls a big swatch of territory in central and southern Italy, the Papal States. And as a image here of the Venetian ghetto, there were multiple ghettos in Venice. And confusingly, the oldest one is named the New Ghetto, Ghetto Novo. It was on its own little island, which is in the center here of this picture. The Roman ghetto, this is a zoom in on a not a great image, but you can see there's the Tiber River at the right, and a little bit of Roman ghetto right there. I think this second image is probably a little better. There's the Piazza Giudea and Ghetto degli Ebrei. So the Roman ghetto that Pope Paul IV had established would last until the Risorgimento, which is the historical nationalist movement and the war that founded the constitutional monarchy of Italy in the 1860s. So this map shows you the patchwork quilt that existed on the Italian peninsula at the time. I've colored in a little bit of it so you can see yellow for Papal States, turquoise for Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and the Piedmont Kingdom up at the left. So eventually, Napoleonic invasions in the north of Italy in the 1790s began to emancipate the Jewish ghetto residents there, because up even the north, despite this tradition of Jewish residents becoming consolidated in the northern half of the peninsula, there was also ghettoization. And the French invading forces, when they washed through these areas in the name of liberté, égalité, fraternité, would tear down the ghettos. They also had a strong, anti-Catholic streak. So all of this changed what had been established. However, in Rome, the Jewish community would have to wait really to the bitter end. Even after the establishment of the new nation state of Italy, which also tore down ghettos and decided that Jews should be emancipated and become citizens of the new Italy. Since the papacy was holding out against the new Italian state, we had to wait for the final defeat and establishment of Vatican City for the Roman ghetto to be dismantled. So just a little taste of what that looked like. So some photos, historical photos of the 19th century and the Roman ghetto. So there's some preservation in art and photography of this poverty-stricken Roman ghetto. It was considered a disgrace once Rome became the capital of the new Italy. And there was a movement to raise the ghetto and tear it down. And it was a densely populated area with closely packed buildings. And they indeed were razed to the ground. So one artist here has a sort of more romantic watercolor image of the Roman ghetto. And this one is showing how the ghetto area would flood via Fiumara. Fiumara like fiume, right? Because it's River Street because it floods. And this shows people coping with the floods. Same artist, Ettore Rosler Franz, shows another square inside the ghetto. Kind of interesting to see how he makes it look maybe a little more communal and colorful and welcoming than the photos do. Like I said, I think this is a touch romanticizing. So why am I showing pizza? Well, a lot of the population with these changes politically, the Italian Jewish population saw themselves not just as Ebrei Italiani, Italian Jews, but as Italiani Ebrei, Jewish Italians. And maybe that sounds like a semantic difference that's not very important, but it was a vision of themselves as Italians first and then Jewish. For example, Dan Vittorio Segre, an Italian who eventually migrated to Israel, recalls in his memoir of growing up, Memoirs of a Fortunate Jew, an Italian Story, how his great-grandfather's generation, so that is the generation we're talking about here, 1860s, 1870s, felt themselves to be more than just Italian citizens. They felt themselves to be the founding fathers of a new nation. And the enthusiasm with which the emancipated Jewish Italians or Italian Jews embraced this new constitutional monarchy of Italy is reflected in the fact that popular names among the Jewish middle class by the end of the 19th century included Regina and Margherita. And these are names drawn from the women of the ruling royal house of Savoia. And that's the same Margherita that we can thank for this pizza, by the way, supposedly. And not only did Jews embrace the new post-Risorgimento Italy, but they succeeded, I think, very out of proportion to their numbers in this new Italy. So some quick statistics from the late 19th and early 20th century show this success. While the Jewish population has always been tiny in Italy, at this point it's probably 1% or smaller. There was consistently about a dozen Italian Jews serving in the Chamber of Deputies and another dozen or so in the Senate. In 1919, there were 6.8% of the professors were Jewish. There was a Jewish prime minister, a Jewish minister of war, 2 Jewish ministers of finance, and a Jewish minister of justice around the turn of the century. So clearly not just surviving in this new Italy, but thriving. However, anti-Jewish prejudice, of course, still existed in the New Italy, and Jews often found themselves adopting the strategy of, as the saying goes, Ebrei a casa, cittadini fuori. So Jews at home, citizens on the street. And there is debate that scholars have, particularly over the role of Catholic Church in the new Italian society. But in general, this period after the Risorgimento through the rise of fascism, which is roughly a generation long, is seen as kind of a golden age or maybe a silver age for the Jewish communities of the Italian peninsula. And the most visible symbol of this success in Italy is this chief synagogue of Rome, which is built in the former ghetto area, which is unmistakable. It's a very large building. It rises high above the other buildings, and it proclaims the presence of the Jewish community. And you might contrast this visually to what the ghetto looked like. So this is a picture of that building, and here it is more recently. These are my pictures, not Armando's. So quite an imposing and impressive building. However, this little golden age, which had begun when Rome finally closed its ghetto in 1870, began to fall apart with the rise of Italian fascism. And while Italy has, of course, given the world many wonderful things, it was in Italy that fascism first emerged in 1919. And while sometimes the word fascism is tossed around without a lot of context or specificity, when I mention it tonight, I just mean that it is the new revolutionary nationalist movement that combines elements of the extreme left and extreme right politics that arises in the early 20th century, and it's named after the fasces, which is in the ancient Roman symbol of the lictorial axe. So you'll see the axe a lot, like in this one little book whose cover I have on the right-hand side of the screen. So it's the togetherness that the fasces represent, the binding, that I think was appealing and where the name kind of took its root from. So in 1922, the Marcia su Roma, the March on Rome, and other events thrust Mussolini, the leader of the PNF, the Partito Nazionale Fascista, the National Fascist Party, into leadership. And then by 1925, Italy was under an authoritarian dictatorship. So some more images about fascism here. There's a lot of stuff online, including a wonderful collection from this this academic source that I've put here. So when Mussolini and the PNF came to power, their platform was not specifically anti-Semitic, unlike the Nazis in Germany. And at this point, we're overlapping with the life of Elsa Morante, born in 1912. And I wanted to give some context to that life by talking about some other people as well. So, for example, here is another family, the Nepi Modona family. And it might be a little strange to see that through patriotism, etc., the family is not necessarily immediately anti-fascist. There's a proud use of a military uniform. There's the legacy of World War I, where many Jewish Italians fought in the war, etc., and thought that service would be recognized by their country. Even some Italian Jews joined the PNF. Don Vittorio Segre, whose memoir of a Fortunate Jew I mentioned previously, recalled that his father would proudly put on a fascist uniform, complete with a fez, a golden belt, a silver dagger. And Dan himself joined fascist youth groups and participated wholeheartedly. And at that period, he didn't remember being uneasy because of his Jewish roots. Mussolini at the time had specifically declared Jews in the 20s and into the early 30s were equal to other citizens, and even had a Jewish mistress, Margherita Sarfati, which again, made people think things were probably going to be okay. Still, other Italians of Jewish origin were strongly anti-fascist, such as the Carlo and Nello Roselli, the Roselli brothers depicted on this slide, who we'll get back to later. They established an anti-fascist movement, Giustizia e Libertà, that had to go underground. They eventually would end up fleeing to France, where they were assassinated by Mussolini agents in 1937. And if that sounds at all familiar, it might be because you've read the Alberto Moravia novel, The Conformist, or seen the Bernardo Bertolucci film, Il Conformista, which is based on those events. Meanwhile, of course, north of the Alps, German fascism is on the rise and has imitated greatly Italian fascism, changing the Roman salute to the Sieg Heil. And then just as Italian fascists had their uniform of black shirts, the Nazis had brown shirts. And like Italian fascism, of course, the Nazis aimed to radically reshape their society. However, as we all know, this was a very explicitly anti-Semitic type of fascism from the beginning, and after the notorious Nuremberg laws were enacted in 1935, this increasingly hostile climate drove many German Jews to Italy, which accepted them as refugees. And through the early 1940s, Italy, in fact, was one of the few European countries that accepted both officially through legal loopholes, thousands of foreign Jews that were fleeing persecution elsewhere. This isn't necessarily pleasant because some of these Jews are put in camps that the fascist government established or sent to forced residency in small rural towns, and depended greatly on the work of Italian Jewish relief organizations on the ground. So just a very contradictory history in these years is, even though Italy begins to slide towards its partnership with Nazi Germany and embrace anti-Semitism officially, it continues to accept foreign Jews. It doesn't have any Nuremberg laws of its own at this point through the early 1940s. However, the climate does change and become worse. Then this poster is in Italian. It explains the race laws that Mussolini enacts in 1938. At first, after the let's see, at first, as I mentioned, Mussolini's regime was not officially anti-Semitic, but eventually it did embrace these racial laws. And after the Anschluss, Mussolini's government launched a state-sponsored media campaign that kicked off with the publication in the summer of 1938 with the Manifesto degli Scienziati Razzisti, the racial manifesto, or the Manifesto of Racist Scientists, which was signed by scientists and other intellectual figures and declared things that personally I find rather laughable, such as the majority of the population of contemporary Italy is Aryan in its origin and its civilization is Aryan, that there is a pure Italian race. It is time that the Italians proclaim themselves to be racist. And then finally, on a much darker note, Jews do not belong to the Italian race. So this campaign culminates in the end of 1938 with the implementation of racial laws very similar to Germany's Nuremberg laws. And these echo some of what Pope Paul IV had espoused back in the 1550s, not just defining who's a Jew, but removing Jews from certain jobs, including any government job, teaching, university professorships, banning marriage between Jews and non-Jews, banning mixing between Jews and non-Jews, such as Jews employing non-Jews as servants, dismissal of Jews from the armed forces, and it went on and on. So at this point, this is the trigger for about 5,000 to 6,000 Jews to immigrate to wherever they could go, including a well-known Florentine composer, Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, who went on to have a great career in New York City. And he wrote later about this moment where he said what he felt cannot be called sorrow, regret, or spiritual suffering. It was almost a physical torment, a tearing asunder, a mutilation. Since that time, something in me has been dead. So clearly a really traumatic moment for the Italian Jewish communities. And scholars debate whether all of this official anti-Semitism on Mussolini's part was purely cynical, purely strategic, to just placate and throw a bone to his German ally, whose military successes were drawing it closer to Italy's northern border. Other scholars have proposed that this was a pernicious consequence of Italian imperial ambitions, which were always tinged with a lot of racism, and which in 1935-1936 had led to a vicious war with Abyssinia, now Ethiopia and Eritrea, in which the Italians used poison gas and committed other war crimes against people deemed racially inferior, and that this colonial effort had somehow this thinking had infiltrated Italian society and was now brought home onto the peninsula. Or whether, and this is perhaps a slightly more extreme position, this was simply an eruption of the anti-Semitism that had always been present within a deeply Catholic Italian society, which one scholar phrased the civilization of the Holocaust, which is, I think, a little more extreme. So somewhere in the middle is where I find myself, where it's a mixture of all of these things, that Mussolini is engaging in realpolitik, that there is undeniable colonial racism, and that the Catholic Church has a long history of anti-Semitism in some of its teachings. So as I mentioned with Castelnuovo Tedesco's reaction, disbelief, shock, horror, were all common reactions. And if you've ever seen the Vittorio De Sica movie, The Garden of the Finzi Continis, or read the novel by Giorgio Bassani that was based on, those reactions are captured fairly well in both the movie and the book. The Nepi Modona family, meanwhile, as I showed earlier in the fascist costume, wrote in his journal in 1938 of his inner turmoil. Who could take this seriously? Certainly not right-minded people. Am I not Italian like the rest? And then he references World War I. there was the reality of all the dead, all those wounded or damaged by the Great War. By their own sacrifice, they had demonstrated how the Jews respond when their fatherland calls them as Italian citizens to fulfill their duty. So just a lot of obviously the shock, consternation, not comprehension of what was going on. Moving forward to 1939, the Pact of Steel is signed on May 22nd. Foreign Jews continue to pour into Italy, and some even trek over the dangerous Alpine passes on foot. It's at this point that Italian Jews set up DELASEM, the Delegazione per l'assistenza degli immigranti ebrei. The acronym is DELASEM. And DELASEM was the Jewish community's way of trying to provide funds, housing, and assistance to the Jewish refugees coming into Italy. It eventually had to go underground and also even facilitated illegal immigrations out of Europe for those fleeing for their lives. So this is a very tumultuous and disturbing background, right? And we haven't even gotten to World War II yet. So World War II, on June 10th, 1940, Italy enters World War II as Germany's ally. This doesn't go well for Italy, obviously. The economy had been strained by Mussolini's various policies and his very expensive war in Abyssinia and rearming efforts. And eventually, after many setbacks, including a disastrous level of deaths among Italian soldiers in campaigns in Russia with the Germans, on July 25th, 1943, Mussolini's dictatorship falls after a palace coup, all of which occurred after the Allies bombed Rome, as shown in these images. So Mussolini is ousted by insiders. There is a period of great uncertainty, and those left in power inside the Italian government form a secret armistice with the Allies. However, news of the armistice leaks. And so on September 8th, 1943, we have a watershed moment where the government abruptly dissolves because the secret armistice is now public. The army was left without its top leaders. The king and some other top officials fled, and there was a state of anarchy and great confusion. The army collapsed, soldiers deserted. Rome was declared an open city in hopes of preserving it from destruction, because it was now assumed that the German allies would invade from the north. So indeed, they did. And if you've seen the Rossellini film, Rome Open City, it's set in this period where Rome has been declared an open city. It's not going to try to defend itself. And this is in hopes of preserving not only the well-being and safety of the civilian population, but the great cultural treasures of Rome. Mussolini would regroup with German support to form a puppet regime backed by the Germans, the Repubblica Sociale Italiana, in the town of Salò. So this has been dubbed the Republic of Salò. And only the most hardcore ultra-right-wing fascists joined Mussolini in this effort in early fall of 1943. And the Republic of Salò only controls a small portion of northern Italy. So let's look at a map again to see what's going on. So it's at this moment of chaos and uncertainty and perhaps even some hope after 20 years of dictatorship and 5 years of life under the race laws, because we're in 1943 and the race laws kicked in 1938, that, of course, Nazi Germany invades Italy from the north. And so this map shows you the major Jewish communities in Italy as of 1938. I didn't have one for 1943. And they're color coded by the size of the population. And you'll notice that Rome is the only purple dot, and that is because Rome has the most largest Jewish communities. So this history that has been going on since the 1490s of driving Jews to the north in Italy is just disastrous in the 20th century. So here we are. Let's get back to Elsa Morante. It's at this point when Germany has invaded Italy and there is so much chaos and tumult, and there's an incipient civil war at the Republic of Salò, establishing itself, and then the uncertainty of, well, who else is going to lead Italy and what will the Allies do? That I would like to just kind of bring it back to Alberto Moravia and Elsa Morante. So they're both Romans. They're both anti-fascist authors. Moravia is quite well known. He's a cousin of Nello and Carlo Roselli, the ones I mentioned who got assassinated for their anti-fascist activities. Um, Moravia had already been in hot water with the Mussolini regime for some time. His novel Indifferenti, which was translated as The Time of Indifference, sparked a lot of interest. He was monitored heavily. He had met the slightly younger Elsa Morante in Rome. She was, like Moravia, of Jewish origin. Um, her a little bit more about her specifically, because I'm assuming Alberto Moravia might be a little more familiar. Um, Elsa Morante was born in 1912 and died in 1985. She was an author principally of prose, including short stories and novellas, and she published 4 novels, and as well as poetry, although she worked on many things that did not end up getting published. She preferred to call herself a poet rather than a writer. She grew up in the Testaccio neighborhood. It's the same area where Maria Montessori would launch her new educational methods around this time. So when Morante was actually a little girl, there was Montessori schooling happening, although she herself did not end up in a Montessori classroom. She had a somewhat unusual family life. Her educated schoolteacher mother, Erma, eventually baptized the children Catholic to protect them, and was very concerned as well with their education. So she wanted to advance her children in the world, obviously, and she saw the Catholic baptism as part of that. The family had a relationship with a Jesuit priest, the one who actually heard their confessions and baptized them, Pietro Tacchi Venturi. If you've ever heard that name, and I'd be a little surprised if you had, but Tacchi Venturi served as a kind of unofficial liaison between Mussolini and the Pope, Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII. And he also helped work on the 1929 Lateran Accords that ended the fierce struggle between the Catholic Church and the Italian government. So he was a very well-placed, highly influential Catholic cleric. It was interesting that this family of working class, lower middle class Jewish Italians had this connection. I think it's just because Rome is a small world. The Morante children, Elsa had a brother and a sister, were pushed towards academic achievement. Elsa's literary talent started early. She produced many things as a child, writing and illustrating her own creations. And her mother recognized her talent and nurtured it well into her teens. The family also had an unusual situation in regards to the children. Another aspect, which only came to light and was really revealed when Morante was a teenager, which was that her father was not her biological father. The man her mother was married to wasn't able to produce children with her. So her mother had a family friend that was the children's biological father, and this family friend would come over, and the marriage was very strained, I think, because of this. So it was a difficult environment for Elsa growing up. Just as they had her mother Erma had tried to help her children by encouraging their education and baptizing them as Catholic. She also had a connection with a more wealthy aristocratic friend who would occasionally take in Elsa. So Elsa's life was sort of swinging between Testaccio in this working class neighborhood and going to a luxurious villa in Rome as a young girl. Very dramatic changes, and this sort of storybook of this godmother who'd sweep in and give her a life of luxury for several months at a pop, I think trickles into her fiction later. With her economic constraints, Elsa, although bright and recognized as a literary talent, wasn't able to attend university. So she offered lessons, was a tutor. She led a very hand-to-mouth, very impoverished existence in her early 20s when she met Moravia. Moravia had family wealth. He was much better established, and their marriage really enabled her to financially and literarily establish herself. She finally had the basis to write her works. She had been also supporting herself in the late 1930s by publishing a variety of short stories and poems, often for children, in various magazines. And with her anti-fascist conviction, she was struggling to make ends meet, partly because she didn't want to produce propaganda, partly because the fascist regime frowned upon women producing literature, and that kind of thing. So it was a very tenuous existence, and her marriage with Moravia sort of launches her to a literary career. She is, let's see, a near unknown at first in Rome's literary circles, and so she struggles to establish herself. And it's not until 1948 that she's really on her way with her literary career as a writer. And so here are some more pictures of Elsa, various stages. The drawing is a self-portrait. Like I mentioned before, she loved cats, and quite often she's shown in photographs with cats. She had a series of Siamese cats in particular. She lived in Rome most of her life, with one exception that I'll get to. And if she looks at all familiar, it's perhaps because you've seen her niece, Laura Morante. Laura Morante is a movie actress, so they look very much alike. Interesting other details about Morante. She's always iconoclastic. She did not go with the trends of the day after the war. She was not a neorealist writer. She wasn't much of a feminist writer because she wanted to be seen on her own merits and not as a woman writer. So she had bones to pick with feminism in the 60s and 70s. She really disliked fame and doing interviews. And so unlike Moravia, who seemed to never lose a chance to hobnob and promote himself, and whose best-selling novels were often made into movies, Morante had a much more greater reserve. And while she mingled in intellectual circles in Rome and cinematic circles, she loved the cinema. She was quite good friends with Pier Paolo Pasolini. She just was one of these people who I think just did not want to be a celebrity, and possibly paid a career price for not being a big self-promoter. She often said that she could be found in her work, and so that she didn't want to do interviews or promotions. She just thought people should read her books. She has a diverse array of inspirations from across European literature. So in Italian literature, she's a big fan of Verga and Ariosto, but she is also a big fan of Cervantes and Stendhal and Melville and Chekhov. And so she's just I think a really interesting and unique figure who starts off from a very tough background and then ends up being a best-selling novelist. So that's a little bit about her. To flash back to, like, oh yeah, this is where she grew up, kind of Testaccio area, circled here in red. You can see it's near the Tempio Maggiore di Roma, the main synagogue where her mother would worship. So there's a little bit about that. So let's get back to 1943. So at this point, Alberto and Elsa, they're living in Rome together, in central Rome. They are staying in Rome after the fall of Mussolini's government, and they are staying through that month of August 1943 and into September. In August, however, Moravia's apartment was searched by authorities. He was able to burn some papers and books. He got word from a well-connected friend that the cops were coming, basically. So he was able to evade problems then. Elsa's sister and her mother had decided already to leave Rome, so it was just Elsa and Alberto kind of left there. His family, I think, also had decided to leave. They, their decision making I find a little odd, honestly. You know, the prospect of a German invasion is imminent. Then it has happened, and yet they are still hanging on in Rome. They both were novelists who would be very absorbed in their process, and they're both working on novels at this point. They would routinely get up and each spend the entire day in separate rooms writing the entire day. So I'm not sure if that has something to do with it or denial or what have you. It's in early September, Moravia is warned by another friend that they are on a list of people to arrest as anti-fascists and Jews. And then he gets a threatening anonymous phone call, which terrifies him. He wrote later, "I felt like a trapped animal, and like a trapped animal, I no longer felt I was a person, an individual, a man. I was merely a lump of threatened existence." So just very frightening. Moravia, as I mentioned, has that kind of self-promoting celebrity thing going on. Morante does not, and so she has very little autobiographical writing, and it's only been recently that folks have been able to pull together a few biographies of her from her estate and papers. So Moravia and Morante finally decide to flee Rome in September of 43, and they initially decide to go to Capri, where they knew some friends had sought refuge. They left on a warm and calm September day, and everyone was convinced the Allies would arrive soon. So they only brought some summer clothes. They hurried to the train station. They were alarmed by the large number of fascists they found there, but they managed to safely board a train to Napoli, and everything seemed to be going smoothly, but the train got stopped at the Fondi station. Bombings had destroyed the rails, and the train could go no further. They did have a connection in the area. So their friend Libero de Libero, who was originally from the Ciociaria, a mountainous area outside of Rome, pointed them towards a family that could host them. So they initially stay near Fondi. The weather is very hot. They're uncomfortable, but they feel safe until roundups with Germans and Italian fascists begin happening. And so they decide to move onwards to head to a more remote area in the mountains further away. So they go to a small town called Santa Agata, and then they end up staying in Santa Agata from late September of 43 through May 1944 with a peasant family. And Elsa Morante, in one of her rare interviews, later said, "I should be grateful to Mussolini. In 1938, he made me realize I was myself a Jew. My mother was Jewish, but the thought had never crossed my mind that there was anything peculiar about having a mother who used to pray in the synagogue. But when the Germans took over Rome in 1943, I learned a great lesson. I learned terror. We were finally given shelter by a peasant family. To them, Jewish or not, we were all Cristiani, and I learned a lot from Ter." So Cristiani is kind of a popular colloquial term to mean people in general are humans, but it literally means Christians. So she's kind of playing a little ironically with, like, we were seen as Cristiani, we were seen as people by these peasants. So here's the Ciociaria in the 1940s. You can see it's very primitive. There is no electricity, no running water, no real communication with the outside world. And Alberto and Elsa had assumed they'd only be there a short time. However, the Allied offense on Rome stalls at the Gothic line, and it's not until 1944 in the spring when Rome is liberated. So Elsa decides to sneak back to Rome that October to gather supplies and winter clothes. And at one point, when she's coming back from their apartment with a large suitcase of winter clothes, a Nazi soldier stops her and offers to carry the heavy suitcase for her as she walks back to the train station. And you can only imagine what she must have felt then. So the key thing that happens, I would say, because for the short sake of time, I want to abbreviate a little bit, with 1943 in Rome, is that you have a a very historic and shameful episode on October 16th, 1943, where the Nazis conduct a roundup of Romans' Jewish populations for deportation to Auschwitz. Lower left corner is one of the few survivors of that deportation of several thousand people. There's a rare photo of it happening at the top left corner, and there's the plot. It's near. It's conducted in a plaza. They gathered people together in a central location before putting them on a train that's near the chief synagogue, which is on the right side of the slide. So Elsa and Alberto miss this horrible episode, but they do both go on to publish literary works about these dramatic moments in their lives. Elsa first writes a story in 1945 about a refugee that heads back to Rome for supplies from a mountain hideout, so very much like her life. Then Moravia writes Two Women, or La Ciociara, Ciociara being the Ciociaran woman, the woman from Ciociara. Which gets made into a movie with Sophia Loren. And both of them, I think, don't write fiction that really references Judaism very overtly here. I think, and I've argued this in some publications, that this is in part due to rejection of the kind of Jewish, in quotes, identity that the Nazis imposed upon them, in part due to their family's assimilation into a Catholic culture and baptism into Catholicism, and also I think due to an acute awareness of not being caught up in the Holocaust directly, that their silence on and the fact that their literature doesn't often have a very overtly Jewish content is kind of a mixture of this position they found themselves in as Italian Jews, Jewish Italians, people with Catholic relatives, Catholicism in their own heritage, etc. And I've been interested scholastically, academically, in how the Holocaust is portrayed by people like Moravia and Morante, both because they're at sort of arm's length from it, but also because I think that when they transform these difficult experiences into literature, we can learn something about how we talk about this kind of history, and what we don't talk about, what we show, what we don't show, and why. As time passes, obviously, direct eyewitnesses to the Holocaust are ever fewer. And so thinking about how fiction portrays these kinds of events, I think is really crucial as we move forward. So Morante, while not experiencing the Holocaust directly herself, ends up being very interested in it and starts researching in the mid-1960s more about the Holocaust. And by the early 70s, a novel is taking shape, and she began to visit the Roman ghetto area, the former ghetto area, daily. And that's when she begins to do the obsessive kind of observations that I mentioned at the very start of my talk. A friend recalls that she'd walk the same little alley back and forth many times. She would enter a house, she'd walk upstairs, she observed minutely many details, she took notes. She wouldn't tell her publisher, her husband, her friends, or colleagues anything about the novel, except to say cryptically, I'm writing a novel for the illiterate. And the novel became La Storia. And these are some pages from the website of the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Roma that preserves her manuscripts. You can see their little watermark on there of her she had a process where she would take a notebook with usually unlined pages and write in it, and then transform that into a typescript manuscript. So you can see here she's just at work writing about La Storia. She was insistent that La Storia, which tells the tale of a poor, widowed, half-Jewish school teacher, very much like her own mother, from the 1930s through the 1960s in Rome, who has two sons. One is the product of a rape perpetuated by a German soldier. That this tale of ordinary people in extraordinary times, she's insistent that it is published in a cheap paperback edition. She really wanted this story to reach the widest audience possible. And surprisingly, for a book that's almost 700 pages long, you can see it's a big hefty book here, kind of, you can see it on Zoom. It became a massive bestseller and sold almost 800,000 copies. Then it got made into not one, but two television miniseries, one of which launched actually earlier in 2023. One was in the 70s and one was in 2023. Um, this this book was highly controversial. I've described it very briefly, but it is really fascinating because she starts off each section of the book with a short paraphrase of what's happening in the wider world, kind of like the top level of history. You know, here's what this government did, here's what this leader did, here's these events, and then she zooms down to these ordinary people and we're caught up in their lives. However, it's it's not a good fit for the Italy of its day, which was, I think, in the sense of the intellectual and literary circles, it's not conforming to left-wing politics. It's not conforming to right-wing politics. Um, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry. She has a lot of stuff in there that people found objectionable, whether it was that it was too much suffering, too much sentimentality for some. Others thought it was, you know, not really expressing communist principles about dialectical struggle of history and classes. So it ended up being highly debated. The controversy went so far as that one paper ran a whole issue saying, is or is not La Storia a masterpiece? Pier Paolo Pasolini thought the first 150 pages or so were a masterpiece, and then the rest was terrible, and they actually had a big falling out about it. Umberto Eco said, perhaps one day we'll realize La Storia was only seemingly a novel aimed at a general public, while in reality it is extremely cultured, very meta-literary one, who knows? There was a nickname for it, Il Romanzone, because it was such a big, long book. And the book's title, if you're not quite up to speed on the Italian part, it means both history and story. So it establishes a complex relationship between history and literature, fiction and fact. To Morante, official history, the stuff that starts each section of the book, is incomplete and even false because it excludes the kind of ordinary people in Rome who are at the heart of the novel. And Morante would also say separately in essays that she wrote that it is necessary for a poet, and remember she thinks of herself as a poet, to transform and find lost history, so that the poet's job is to find this, what she calls poetic truth, to go through anguish with open eyes. This is the only reason for art. This is its necessary realism. So her argument in La Storia is that she's conveying something that's been lost to history, something true, even if it's not real, or it's realistic, even if it's not real. She includes lullabies, songs, graffiti, dreams, hallucinations, visions induced by drugs, drunken ramblings, poems, Roman dialect, Judeo-Roman dialect, baby talk, and she even gives animals key roles as characters and includes their thoughts and feelings in the book. So it's a highly unusual book. There's several searing passages about the Holocaust from the Stazione Tiburtina, where the train holding Rome's Jews is kept for over a day before the deportation happens, to the feelings aroused by the 1938 race laws. And so while I don't have time to go through the long sequence where Ida, the widow at the heart of the book, and one of her sons stumbles into accidentally coming across the deportation train, which I find just an incredible scene. I would like to share a brief excerpt of one character's experience of racial persecution in Italy. She saw the thunderous magnitude of destiny advancing towards her door, growing more enormous day by day. The news broadcasts, with their menacing voices, already seemed to be physically invading her little rooms, and she spent her days and evening on guard, like a little wounded fox that has gone to earth and strains to hear the barking of the pack. So just a little taste there of Morante, who also, like I said, very, very much loves animals and includes them in many books as key characters. So let's see. With my time running short, I just wanted to say that if you haven't read La Storia, it is available in English translation by I believe it's William Weaver. It's not the best translation, but it is a really good translation. It does open with a scene of violence, sorry to say. And the events that it chronicles in part are commemorated in Rome to this day. Like October 16th is a big holiday in Rome. And Morante's book, due to its massive success and the two different television miniseries, is probably one of the tellings of the Holocaust stories that is most familiar to most Italians, I would venture. It's also one of the few depictions that has focused on Italy in the Holocaust. So often Holocaust novels and films focus on understandably the camps and Poland and other places, but this is a very Italian version of the Holocaust, thanks to Morante's unique situation as a Roman Jewish Italian. She even received fan mail about this book. There was, for example, there's one piece of mail that reads, "I'm an 18-year-old attending high school. I read La Storia with enthusiasm. I was so moved. I did not live through the horrors of the war, but I found in your book some pieces of my father's life. I found the whole world of humble people in which I live. Signora, I deeply thank you." So it just very, very interesting book. This was probably by far her best-selling book, and she would not write another book that reached anywhere near the heights of this one in terms of just the commercial success. Interestingly, as well, this I think desire by Morante to really show what this history was, led her to almost flirt with plagiarism in the book. It has been discovered by a scholar, Risa Sodi at Yale University, that Morante quoted so closely from some of her historical sources that it in Sodi's mind, it almost verges on plagiarism. And I think that just goes to show how seriously Morante took the subject, but it is very interesting that she felt, while she proclaimed the role of fiction and the need to have an artist interpret events, that she herself couldn't deviate too far from the actual facts. In 2000, Italy did pass a law for the Giornata della Memoria, the Day of Remembering, which commemorates the extermination and persecution of Jewish people and those deported from Italy to Nazi camps. And I don't want to end on a sour note, right, or a sad note. This is a wonderful book that has, I think, so much empathy, so much imagination. It's a ringing condemnation of Mussolini's regime and of fascism more generally. In fact, Francisco Franco, the Spanish fascist dictator who was still alive when La Storia came out in 1974, banned it in Spain. And Morante said, in the 1976 or so, that now when I'm almost an old woman, I felt I couldn't depart from this life without leaving a testimonial memory of the crucial era in which I was born. Besides being a work of poetry, my novel La Storia wants to be an accusation of all the fascisms of the world, and at the same time, it represents an urgent and desperate demand addressed to everybody for a possible communal awakening. And I think if you read La Storia, or even just a part of it, because again, it is a very long book, you'll see what she means about this sense of um, participating in an awakening, and thinking about the lives of ordinary people and how they matter even if they fall out of what we might consider history or a history textbook. And I wanted to conclude with just a few pictures that I took of Rome's Jewish neighborhood today. Life does go on, and there are many restaurants, businesses. You can take a tour of the main synagogue. It also has a wonderful bookstore of all kinds of things. So just, just a few photos to share. And that is all I have for you today. I'd be happy to answer some questions. I see there's some things in the chat, but it looks like it's yeah.
Gabriel, thank
Yeah.
you so much. What a
Mhm.
fabulous, fabulous lecture. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I really
really
love
great.
Elsa Morante. What can I
Really
say?
great.